I don't know if we want to jump to talking about like, liberal bias or a left bias in media, because obviously
Yeah, we can skip to that
you
topic.
know,
Yeah,
well, I mean, so yeah, so we've talked about that. I think that informing people as a journalist is a vital service. Producing that first draft of history in real time is important, but also there's we do have in media, at least some of us journalists do have this, you could call it kind of a rose colored glasses or starry eyed view that we are contributing to the society in a service, in the context of we're providing a service to our democracy because we are informing people. If people are more informed in this democracy, they're more likely to engage in it in more positive ways that it will improve it. Right. So that's why government transparency should be celebrated. It's why laws like, Freedom of Information Act for FOIA requests are such a vital thing for us as journalists, and having government that feels that they have to respond to to the media is important, and feeling like they have to engage with it and not just shut it out or demonize it as we've seen recently.
absolutely. And so, yeah, on that note of whether or not, like, the classic thing of, I know Colbert used to meme on it, talking about how, like, because of the whole, generally speaking, conservative side, especially the U.S., will say, like, oh, media has, or mainstream media is like the new one, obviously, has a
Yeah.
liberal bias. And then Colbert used to meme on that, saying that, like, reality has a well-known liberal bias. Um, and I think it's important to understand that, and I kind of want you to touch on this. I think it's important to understand that literally everyone, there is literally no media, and I mean media not just in actual, like, news. I mean, there is nothing that is created by a person that does not have bias. There is always
Yeah.
bias. The question is,
Yeah.
can we look at the contradictions within what is being said, and is it built on stable ground? And if it isn't, then that's when we need, and that's why it's important to take aspects from as many different sides as possible, to
Yeah.
to understand it better.
Well, there's a few things that activate, like when I have this conversation, because it's really interesting to me. I have been, as a journalist, I have been blamed for the issues that I'm reporting on, that I'm letting people know are happening. Like, I mean, in a sense, shooting the messenger, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like when we talk about, and you often do hear people on the right say, well, the media, and I imagine this guy like kind of wild-eyed pointing into the distance, the media, right?
Right.
And the thing that I there's a few different ways to think about it, and the first one is, well, what are we even talking about when we say the media? Because the media, like, are you just talking about the news media? Because we have entertainment media, right? We have all other, I mean, just there's the fashion media, there's
Yeah.
tech
Social
tech
media,
media, yeah.
magazines, TV
Well,
shows, like movies,
well,
literally
but then,
everything.
so right there, I was making really quick, and this is how I'd like to try to parse it out: is there's the genres of media, right? Like entertainment media, infotainment, and all the different sects of fashion media, tech media, whatever. But then on top of it, you have the actual physical media. Like, how are you consuming it? What are you
Very
talking about? Are you
true.
talking about print media? Are you talking about television news media? Or if we're going to just talk about news media, are you talking about the radio, audio, podcasts, internet? And then social media is quite different from just news media, because social media, news media has been forced to port into it in every possible way they can, because that's what everybody's using now. But
Right.
social media, in a way, is a whole other, like, entity, right?
Right.
And it's not just the internet, right? We have the internet, but then there's social media is a platforms, or a platform within that. But generally speaking, and when we back up a little bit, you can read Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky. There's a lot of media critique where you look at the societal influences on media, right? So you recognize that newspaper owners have interests, and they very much will, even though in some idyllic way they're not supposed to, they will exert their influence over a newsroom, right? I worked at a newspaper that was a free weekly, and so you had two parts of the paper that were really not supposed to, um, influence one another, and that was advertising and editorial, right? And so, I did stories where like I mentioned, an institution, or I wrote things about an institution that I was not aware the advertisers were working on a deal with them, and the fallout from my reporting was that the paper lost money, right? Because of that. So I was lucky to be in an independent newspaper
Very.
that they really wouldn't exert that influence. But here in Santa Barbara County, we have a very famous newspaper in Santa Barbara, the Santa Barbara News Press. It did tons of reporting on the Santa Barbara oil spill in the 60s or the 70s
Right.
that really helped spur the modern environmentalist movement. And this paper years ago was bought up by a conservative billionaire, and she immediately began exerting her influence on the newspaper and chipping away and removing positions and making life hard for people there, where over time it's become a bit of an embarrassment, where it was once this prestigious paper. And then they do things like after the AP said we're not going to use the term illegal to refer to people like illegals,
Right.
right?
Right.
We're
Right.
talking about undocumented people. They ran a really embarrassing headline over a photo of a bunch of Latina people in line at the DMV after a certain law was passed, and that allowed undocumented people driver's licenses, and it just said illegals line up for driver's licenses. And so you see how the influence of ownership over a newspaper can affect it. Mentioning what I said about the Spanish flu, the government will have an influence over
Absolutely.
media. Law
Absolutely.
enforcement, law enforcement will reach out to if a journalist calls law enforcement and so starts asking questions about a case, and and they will do this. A journalist will say, "Well, we have information to suggest such and such. Do you have comment on that?" If you go to a high enough agency, I'm talking like the FBI, the feds,
Right.
they will come to the paper with lots of lawyers and paperwork and say you cannot run this; it will affect our investigation.
Oh, of
And
course. Yeah.
you know what I mean. So there's all these influences that affect newspapers, television media. Of course, television media. You also, I've neglected to mention the profit motive and how advertising sells so much media, whether it's television media, newspaper media. The paper I worked for didn't have subscribers. There was no delivery of this paper. It's in the community. You can pick it up for free. So it's entirely advertising based, right?
Right.
And so you might see in other parts of the country where a weekly paper like this, it might have pretty risque or out there stories because they have a bunch of strip clubs and bars and dispensaries advertising in them. But in this community, we have a strip club, and
Right.
there's a little teeny tiny ad in the back, but that also just would reflect the editorial direction of the paper, because it's in this community. We're not in Miami. We're not the Miami Weekly.
Right.
We're not, you know what I mean?
Right.
So there's all of that, all of these internesting factors that affect, how and why newspapers focus on what they focus on.
Right. And I think that's why it's important to point out, and you made very good points on that, where it's like the profit motive tied in because of advertising. Like, why am I
Yeah.
going, if I'm, why on earth would I give money to a news organization to advertise something if they're going to say something negative about me? And that's why it's
Yeah.
really important in
Yeah.
understanding. Like, it's like I always say to people, like, if you're signing up for, a credit card or anything, like making any financial decision, it's like you need to ask two questions. One, who stands to gain from this? Two, how is it going to fuck me? Like, the reality is
Yeah.
that's how it works within a capitalist system, is someone is having to gain the upper hand on the other.
Hmm.
We need to understand, you as a consumer within that system need to understand, how do I maximize my outcome, and how do I better understand who is behind this, what's going on? Because as you mentioned, like, even out, and because a lot of people I feel like don't realize this, they don't necessarily think of it, like outside of news, where people are like, oh, there's a liberal bias in news. Just so everyone's clear, any movie where they feature the CIA, the US military, they have to literally work directly with those organizations to get permission. That's why you don't see American made movies that are critical, highly critical of
Yeah.
those organizations, with the closest being something where it's like, you know, what's the Vietnam Apocalypse Now? Something like
Yeah.
that, where it's a
Hmm.
very, metaphorical discussion on it, but you don't see those direct. And I think one that was more egregious was, and this is in every country. This is not something that
Yeah.
is just U.S. specific,
Yes.
because the reality is that, of course, yes, the Soviets, everything was state-controlled media. The Soviets
Hmm.
definitely put out stuff that was overt propaganda
Oh
anti-U.S.
yeah. Yep.
However, when we go back and we think, the classic example is Dr. Zhivago, which is a movie from the 1960s about the
Hmm.
October Revolution in Russia, and it literally was like one of the main funders was the CIA. Like, it was
Yeah.
specifically anti-Soviet propaganda. Now,
Yeah.
then on top
Well,
of that, my favorite, because you mentioned being into like film stuff growing
yeah.
up, my favorite was that showed this was how the bad guys in American movies shift over time. Like in the 1980s, they're mostly Russian. Before
Yep.
that, they're mostly German. In the
Yep.
1990s, 2000s, they're mostly vaguely Arab. Like, it's
Hmm.
uh, it's manufactured consent. Like, it's exactly
Yeah.
that. But my
Well, I'll
point is,
give you one. I'll
all
give you one a
media.
little more. Yeah, I'll give you one a little more recently. Saving Private Ryan. For in order for filmmakers like Steven Spielberg to get access to, literally millions of dollars worth of military hardware, jeeps, bombers, all the stuff that the military maintains. World War II operational technology,
Right.
guns, helmets, uniforms. The State Department gets a say on the script. Like,
It's
if people don't know that, there's a reason why Saving Private Ryan, is one of the most like heralded World War II movies for how it depicts, but it's an entirely manufactured story about based on a premise that did not exist during World War II, which was this whole family's lost every man, every son has died except this one. We're gonna go rescue him, and sacrifice a whole unit just to go get this one kid. Just
right.
didn't happen in World War II,
Right.
and it was to promote this idealism around it. But the other thing that I find really interesting about this is, so I understand the people who call just the media liberal media, right? It might be that in newspapers around the country, generally people might have a more left or liberal lean. Doesn't mean that it's a true left bias, because even within the industry, you might be a left or liberal minded person, but you're trained in all these different ways within the industry, because them saying that has gotten so into the heads of media around the country, and because of certain things about the industry. There are a lot of ways where that liberal bias in some ways doesn't exist and works in the reverse. So one
Right.
example is the deference to law enforcement. Only recently are we seeing, there have always been news outlets that will challenge and investigate local law enforcement agencies. The paper I worked at was a good example of that. But also the deference to law enforcement in that, one of the great things about the paper I worked at, the weekly, was that we were not like the daily, which whatever mugshot that the PD would provide, usually of brown people,
Right.
would be run on the cover always. And again, these are allegations. They're arrested. They're not, convicted or tried at all. It's, we've arrested people in connection with and suspicion of, right? And
Right.
here's an interesting way in which this played out. Here in Santa Maria, California, we had a big scandal with a previous police chief, Danny McConaughey, where he ran the department very poorly. It ended up with an officer who was having a relationship with a 17-year-old police explorer. Right, this
Oof.
is this weird relationship where underage kids, teenagers, hang out with police, right?
Right.
And this officer was preying on them through a bunch of just very poor decisions. They attempted to arrest him while he was on duty with his sidearm, and they sent like the guy's cousin and his man of honor from his wedding to arrest him. And the guy ends up pulling his gun, and he was shot and killed by his fellow officers. So there was this
Damn.
big scandal. That ain't even the thing I'm getting to, right?
Right.
So there was this big scandal. McConaughey retires, right? He's not expelled or anything. He leaves town on a golden parachute pension, right? And then we have brought in this this other chief who came from LA County Sheriff's Department, which is not known for not having its own problems, but this chief came to clean up the department, move it into a big new state of the art, fully funded, massive, precinct, and really modernize the department. Geez, I'm trying to remember this chief's name, and I'm blanking on it a little bit, and I'll see if it comes back up as we're doing this, but as I'm talking about it. But so this is really interesting. There were a few years, I think it was like 2015, like right around the Trump time. In fact, there was a woman murdered here in town that Trump mentioned during his run, and she was murdered by
Gotcha.
an undocumented immigrant. But so what happened was MS-13 was sweeping through California, other parts of the country, and the homicide rate spiked in several major cities: Bakersfield, Salinas, Santa Maria. We are one of the larger cities between like Ventura and County and Salinas. And we have street gangs, but our local street gangs don't really commit that many shootings or drive-bys, or at least didn't a lot. They're mostly stabbings and maybe smaller shootings. But for a year or so, there was just a rash of drive-bys, double homicide, triple shooting, all these different things. And it was basically MS-13 sweeping through California, trying to dominate the local street gangs and take over the drug trade. Now, in order to convict a bunch of these MS-13 guys who had committed crimes in Santa Maria, our local PD and this police chief, Ralph Martin, that was his name, Chief Ralph Martin, he was looking at all these guys. They're working with the FBI, they're working with ICE. They called it Operation Matador, and they were going after these MS-13 guys. So what happened? They had these two witnesses, both undocumented, and they wanted to have them testify against these MS-13 members, but they, through monitoring MS-13, whether their phones or however they were monitoring them, they became aware that the MS-13 gang members knew that these guys had been arrested, and that there was a possibility of them talking. Okay, so what does Chief Ralph Martin do? He releases a press release to this is just before the 2016 election. He released a press release to all local media that these two men had been deported for committing some kind of theft or something. Now, my paper was basically the only local outlet that didn't run it, because we understood that, because we weren't in the business of running every mugshot the local police department sends us. That's what made us independent media. One of the things, we're also a weekly. We don't have the room to run every mugshot. That was something the daily paper would do. The television media, all these local media outlets ran, of course, just uncritically, didn't ask any questions. But even our journalist who was on like the crime beat, kind of his ears perked up, and he said that, but we don't, like, that's not usually how California police agencies do. They don't deport people. They don't send people to ICE for these types of crimes, right? That's not standard operating procedure. So he was a little curious about that. And the same journalist, months and months later, is going through the court transcripts of this big Operation Matador, as they called it. And in one paragraph in this thick stack of court documents, did one officer allude to the fact that they had put out fake news. They had manufactured lies that they had deported these people to protect their identity, or to protect the safety of their family, so these MS-13 guys wouldn't go for them. And all local media ran it entirely uncritically, because the law enforcement knew that they could, turn local media into a puppet for their purposes, and didn't think anything would come of it. our reporter called the police chief, Ralph Martin, and he kind of just chuckled and went, huh, I didn't think anybody would find that. So, but yeah, I
Yeah,
did. And so it became national news after we broke it that local police department sends out fake news, because that's when the whole idea of fake news
of
was
course.
really becoming a thing. So that anecdote illustrates this one example of, you can call the media liberal media, but even then, like, journalists, whether they might have a liberal or whatever slant themselves, are trained, and just by nature of the industry, to police send you something that, well, you can take it to the bank because it's the police.
Right. And
You know, they're not gonna lie.
right. And then to add one little put a pin in this,
Yeah,
yeah, I think it's also important to understand that when we talk about, like you're saying, you need to look at what structures are supporting this, who stands to benefit from the news that they put out,
yeah,
who is financially tied. Because, as an example, that's why when people say, like, oh, forget the ignoring that Fox is the biggest of the mainstream media, but
yeah,
they'll say, like,
yeah.
ABC, CNN, like, listen, yeah, maybe they're liberal biased. They are not left biased. Like, CNN is literally owned by Ted Turner. Like, the guy
Yeah,
owns most of Montana.
yeah,
Like, ABC is owned by Disney. They're in the S&P
mhm,
500. Like, this
yep,
is not, they're not lefties. Like, yeah, they may
exactly.
say some things that are
Yeah,
socially progressive, but
yep.
that's not leftism. Like, they're
Well,
not advocating for material change because it's not in their interest to do so. You
yeah,
know,
well, but then you're going to have to explain to most
of
of
course,
red America that there's a difference between left and liberal.
of
And
course,
according to them, I mean, even Joe Biden is the corporate centrist, pro bank, pro credit card guy.
right,
He's a communist, just like Bernie
right,
Sanders, right?
and
So
and
that's that type
and
of
and for anyone
challenge.
that is, the simplest way that I can say it, and I'll do a video on this as well, but the simplest way I can
Mhm.
say it is the difference between a leftist and a liberal. A liberal believes that the difference is whether or not they believe that private property should be a thing. I mean,
Yeah,
functionally, towards the end, that's what you're looking at. You're looking for,
yeah,
one is pro-capitalist, one is pro-capitalist, but a soft form of capitalism, meaning that
hmm,
they want there to be social progressiveness within capitalism, but they
hmm,
don't have a problem with markets. Whereas a
hmm,
leftist sees that the contradictions within capitalism will not allow it to continue to exist without degrading people's individual freedom, because you need both economic and political freedom in order to be free. With
yeah.
markets and people who have way more being able to control those markets, you do not have economic freedom. That's what leftists
Exactly.
oppose.
Yeah, and under that umbrella of liberalism, like, I mean, the small L liberalism, you have both political parties
Right.
operating throughout American history, and having their own media outlets that are sympathetic to them. I mean, go back to the founding, you had newspapers that were, that the editors and the publishers were, Democratic Republicans, leaning with on the Jeffersonian side,
Right.
and you had John Adams
And Hamilton,
Federalist
yes.
type, yeah, and Hamilton Federalist newspapers that were leaning on that side, and they're the ones, dropping stories about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings.
Right.
Stormy Daniels ain't got nothing on that. So
Right. And
this is as old as America.
oh,
That
absolutely.
that's what I try to get across to people is, like trying to have a non-biased, any type of non-biased media. Well, it's just, then you don't understand how media has operated, will operate, and of course those are just political interests. Then we're not even
Right.
talking about the industry interests, the corporate interests, the money interests that go into that as well.
Exactly. If you enjoyed this clip, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out the full live version of the Wealth for 99 podcast, where we talk finance, economics, and public policy from a working class perspective. We'll see you there.